My name is John Passfield, and the title of this reading will be The Poetic Novel Part 2, Video 14, That Summer in Paris. So here is my book. I'll just hold it up. There's a title, there's a subtitle, there are 3 roses, and my name. And now I'll explain those. The copy's a manuscript, but there's a copy on my website at johnpassfield.ca, which is available to read for free. All you do is click on the cover icon and the book will be yours to read. The subtitle is Influences and Elements, as the essays in the book are about the writers who have influenced me and the elements that I've developed in my pursuit of a form for the poetic novel of our time. Now, the 3 roses. Gertrude Stein said a rose is a rose is a rose. So that's an image about imagery. So it's something that if you think about it, you get all kinds of interesting ideas. But it's an image about imagery. A rose is a rose is a rose. The quotations in this essay, my essay, are from the book That Summer in Paris, which happens to be 1929, by Morley Callahan. I will read 3 of the 11 segments of my essay, and then I will read a note which I wrote as I reviewed my essay for this presentation. So here's the first quotation from Morley Callahan's book, That Summer in Paris. Fitzgerald had seen a copy of The Great Gatsby on the table, and he picked it up, looking pleased. The sale of the book had been very disappointing to him. He said, not that it hadn't done reasonably well, but no one would have called it a big seller. But there'd been an explanation. It was too short a book, he said. It was the one thing that was the matter with the book. Remember this, Morley. Never write a book under 60,000 words. So that's the quotation. It's Morley Callahan meeting F. Scott Fitzgerald, and Fitzgerald commenting on what he considered to be the drawback of The Great Gatsby. Now, here's my response to that quotation. I taught The Great Gatsby when I was a high school teacher of English literature and composition, and I found it to be a very enjoyable classroom novel. It always evoked excellent discussions in the senior students. It has a glow that's hard for a writer who would like to write glowing novels to pin down. There's a magic to it. I did understand that Fitzgerald had read Conrad, presumably Lord Jim and Heart of Darkness, and had decided to pace the revelation of information about Gatsby along the lines of the Conrad form. Fitzgerald had been a very popular best-selling novelist, and high sales seems to have been important to him. So that when he departed from what I would assume the book trade and the readers were expecting in terms of form, the drop in sales seems to have taken away his sense of direction. Until then, I assume that he felt that he could write serious literature and popular novels at one and the same time, as embodied in one and the same book. But then he seems to have come to a point where the 2 ideals diverged on different paths. I realize that the biographies tell us that the drinking and the partying undermined his writing career. And this seems to be the major point that Hemingway took from his relationship with Fitzgerald. But I would suggest that the lack of sales for The Great Gatsby hit Fitzgerald hard. I wouldn't care to say whether the need to make a decision about his purpose in writing novels or the drinking and the social life and the marriage to Zelda came first, but there's definitely a change in the Fitzgerald ability to just go ahead and write his novels after the publication of that book. The slowness with which he worked on what became his next novel, Tender as the Night, can be attributed to his social life and his drinking, I'm sure, but I think it's also attributable to his lack of a sense of direction. It's been said that inside the covers of that novel, Tender as the Night, there are 2 or 3 novels that, had he written them within a year or 2 of his idea of those novels, would have given him about 3 separate novels. His decision at 2 different times to structure the order of chapters in a different way also suggests that he wasn't sure whether he was writing serious literature or whether he was writing popular fiction for the bestseller list. Fitzgerald's letters to Scotty, his daughter, near the end of his life, in which he laments the fact that he didn't stick to the path that the great Gatsby had indicated to him, are heartbreaking to read, and they certainly struck a chord with me as I was starting out on my own novel path. What if you get to near the end of your writing career and you realize you followed the wrong path, and you kind of knew it at the time, but you did it anyway? Here's another quotation from Morley Callahan's book. Scott apparently had some need of the kind of close friendship he thought he could get from Ernest Hemingway. Seemed to me that Scott wanted to offer incredible loyalty to Hemingway. Look at what had happened when Scott had believed I wasn't sufficiently impressed by that passage from A Farewell to Arms, Hemingway's novel. Here's my response to that quotation by Callahan. During my teaching career, when I was doing a lot of reading in the novels and the short stories of Hemingway and Fitzgerald, and then the biographies of these two writers, the relationship between the two of them was quite fascinating to me. I don't know whether I used the term myth, M-Y-T-H, when I wrote my early planning notebooks and journals, but what I would say now is that Scott Fitzgerald had an actual relationship with Ernest Hemingway, in which they met in the real world, and he also had a mythical relationship with Hemingway, in which both Hemingway and himself, Scott Fitzgerald, were mythical creatures in a mythical pattern. I would also say that Ernest Hemingway had an actual relationship with Scott Fitzgerald, in which they also met in the real world, and he also had a mythical relationship with Scott Fitzgerald, in which both Fitzgerald and himself, Ernest Hemingway, were mythical creatures in a mythical pattern. So I'm saying the same thing twice, but I'm saying it from Fitzgerald's point of view and from Hemingway's point of view, a shared myth. Fitzgerald seems to have seen Hemingway as the ideal writer, so the myth of the ideal writer. Hemingway to Fitzgerald was the writer who never let anything get in the way of his ability to write the best books of which he was capable. Now, since myths are built on the selection of potentially significant information, with the acceptance of some information and a rejection of other information as insignificant, I would suggest that Fitzgerald only admitted the information that would prove that his myth was viable, and rejected all of the information that would prove that his myth of Hemingway was not viable. Image selection as a means of building a myth, image rejection as a means of building a myth. Hemingway, on his side, seems to have seen Fitzgerald as the failed writer, as a writer who let other things, social life, drinking, wives, writing for money, undermine his ability to write the best books that he was capable of writing. As mentioned above, the myth depended on the discarding of the information that would disprove the viability of the myth, and the raising to significant status excuse me, of the information that would prove the viability of the myth. So same thing. Image acceptance and image rejection in order to build a myth. I believe that both writers, if one looks at the letters they wrote to one another over the years, promoted the myth to each other. They both believed it and they both promoted it. Hemingway willingly took on the role of the superior manager of the writing career, and Fitzgerald willingly took on the role of the failed manager of the writing career. However, I don't think the reality is quite as simple as both writers believed it to be. Hemingway certainly had a long fallow period in the 1930s when he wasn't writing the best work that he was capable of, and Fitzgerald turned out a corpus, a body of work, which many other writers would be pleased to have been able to achieve. Whether believing in the myth, the shared myth, helped or hurt Hemingway, or helped or hurt Fitzgerald, is a question that would be interesting for literary critics and biographers to pursue. Now, perhaps I should refrain from mentioning Othello and Iago in a context of a relationship of Hemingway and Fitzgerald. Perhaps I will content myself with simply mentioning these two friends in quotation mark, and leave it at that. So, were Othello and Iago really friends? Were Hemingway and Fitzgerald really friends? Do friends help each other or hurt each other in the long run? Okay, here's a third quotation from Marley Callahan. Yet Ernest, for some reason I couldn't understand, some ridiculous scene between them, no doubt, or some series of irritations, or maybe because of some view he had of Scott and Scott's work, simply didn't want to be bothered with him. Hemingway did not want to be bothered with Fitzgerald. That's the Marley Callahan quotation. Here's my response to that. I think that Hemingway was afraid of something in himself, and in his view of Scott Fitzgerald as a mythical creature, the failed writer. He came to see Scott Fitzgerald as embodying the element that he was so afraid of in his own mental makeup. I think that all of the things that Hemingway detested in the life of F. Scott Fitzgerald can be attributed to Hemingway himself at some time during the life of his writing career. Hemingway, too, encountered distracting social pursuits, excessive drinking, difficulty with wives, and writing for money. It has been remarked by biographers that accounts of Hemingway's behavior towards others could differ quite widely. There are those who say that Hemingway was quite kind and gentle and friendly, and there are others who say that Hemingway was quite brutal and savage and cruel. I would say that the reason for these extremes of behavior is that Hemingway tended to mythologize the actual people of his life. Not all of them, but certainly ones who had pertinent qualities that he exaggerated in his mind to the point where they became representatives of forces in his own mental makeup. And so he treated the people he encountered, and the people he spoke about and wrote about, even members of his own family, with these two extremes of Hemingway behavior and comment. They all represented something in his own mind, forces at work in his own mind. So he loved them extremely, or he hated them extremely. There are writers who can mythologize in their writings the forces that they see as operating in their own personal lives, and the lives of their societies, and the lives of all human beings who respond to life on this planet, and yet are able to keep such ideas separate from the way those writers react to and behave towards the people in their personal lives. However, Hemingway, it seems to me, was not one of them. He never seemed to take a day off from mythologizing the people whom he spent time with and the people he thought about. Perhaps I could say that Fitzgerald mythologized Hemingway in his personal life. Hemingway mythologized many people, almost everyone, in his personal life. Well, I'll stop reading there. The rest of the essay can be found for free on my website at johnpassfield.ca. And now, I'll read a note which I wrote as I read this essay over for my video presentation. So here's the new note then. In reading over this essay, I realized that an interesting thing happened to me as I was responding to Marley Callahan's nonfiction book. I seemed to have started out to write about Marley Callahan and end up writing about something that I've written about many, many times before. The topic that I've written about many, many times is the relationship between the two writers, Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald. Of course, the trigger for my thoughts on the two writers is that Callahan spent the summer of 1929 in their company, though he points out that by that time the two were not meeting each other, even when they were in the same city at the same time. I don't regret turning my Marley Callahan essay into my Hemingway and Fitzgerald essay, because I realize that there are certain key topics that one returns to time and time again, because, 2 points here. One seems to realize that there are keystone motifs for all the one's reading, and if one is a writer, for all the one's writing. And number 2, that a topic is so rich in its complexity that it bears returning to time and time again, as one is always able, incrementally, a bit at a time, to add something of one's understanding of that complexity to the body of ideas that the particular topic triggered in the imagination in what for me is now many years ago. So over many years, I've added a little bit more thought to that basic keystone situation. So, not only have I written about Hemingway and Fitzgerald in my Morley Callahan essay, I've written a separate Scott Fitzgerald essay and 2 Hemingway essays in my series of books, The Poetic Novel, which now numbers 2 books, and in many of the planning notebooks and reflective journals, which I write as accompaniments to the writing process of each item of fiction, each novel and novella that I write. So I've written about these 2 over and over. I was adding something, I hope, a little more deeply, a little more interestingly, I guess. My theory about the Hemingway-Fitzgerald relationship is my theory about the relationship of all human beings, not only of any 2 people, but of individuals and their relationships to groups of people, of groups of people in relation to other groups of people, including the relationships of societies to societies and of nations to nations. We all mythologize, and we do so by selecting and rejecting information that will add to the myth that we are creating of these other individuals, these other groups, these other societies, these other nations. As sure as I am that I will continue to write planning notebooks, reflective journals, and essays, I'm sure I will write in future about the relationship of Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald. I've learned a lot from my contemplation of this topic. I'm sure there's a lot more that I still have to learn. So once again, I'll hold this up. This is my book, the Poetic Novel 2, Influences and Elements. It's not found on Amazon because it's not a physical book. It's not found on my publisher's website. It is found as an electronic book, I guess we call it, on my website, johnpassville.ca. Just click on the cover icon and the text of the book will be there. It's a book with 15 essays on different topics, but all topics concern literature, concern the novel, and concern the poetic novel. So have a look if you're interested in any of these topics. Lastly, I'll just say thank you for watching this video.